Welcome to Around the Storage Block video blog. I'm your host, Calvin Zito, and joining me today is Kip Glover, who's going to show us some tips on how to upgrade MSA firmware. Kip, show us what you got.
Thanks, Calvin. Welcome to the HPE MSA Storage Firmware Update Best Practices, Part 1 of 3, Controller Firmware. Running inactive firmware can expose you to risk and known issues that could possibly violate support contracts. It's important to keep your MSA firmware up to date. Not only does running the latest firmware help you maximize your MSA availability, it also resolves issues, fixes security vulnerabilities, and delivers new features. There are 3 user upgradable firmware components in the MSA. First is the controller firmware. Second is the expansion module firmware. And third is the drive firmware, both SSD and HDD drives. In this session, we are focusing on the best practices for updating MSA controller firmware. In future best practices sessions, we will cover MSA expansion module firmware and drive firmware. There are multiple ways to update controller firmware in the MSA. The controller firmware can be updated from smart components, the storage management utility, SMU, or FTP. As a best practice, it is recommended to use either the Linux or Windows smart components for the controller firmware update. This session is focused on using the smart components to update the MSA controller firmware. The update can be performed while the MSA is online in a dual controller configuration. It is also best to perform the upgrade during a time of low I/O array activity. Smart components manage the firmware upgrade process. They put the controllers into best practices prior to upgrading. They monitor and resolve known issues during the upgrade. In the end, the smart component also validates a successful upgrade. Let's walk through an actual firmware update using the Windows Smart component. First, we need to check what controller firmware versions are running on the MSA. Start and log in to the SMU. In this example, we are using version 3 of the SMU interface. At the top of the home screen, expand the System menu drop-down and select Update Firmware. The Update Firmware pop-up screen appears. On the default first tab, we find the running controller firmware versions. In this example, we have an MSA 2040 running controller module firmware GL220P010 on both controller A and controller B. Alternatively, from the command line or CLI, run the command show versions to view the running controller version. The best way to determine the current and recommended controller firmware version is to visit www.hpe.com/storage/MSA firmware. Once here, you can quickly see that the latest MSA 2040 controller firmware is version GL225R003. Clicking either of the 2 download links, Linux or Windows, will take you to the Smart Component download page on the HPE Support Center. In our example, this MSA 2040 storage system needs a firmware update because the controllers are running GL220P010 as shown in the SMU and CLI. We will download the Windows Smart component for the controller version GL225R003. It's important to note the expansion module firmware is included in the controller firmware bundle. When installing controller firmware, the process will also update the firmware on the MSA I/O expansion modules in the attached drive enclosures if it's needed. This does not include the D2700 expansion module firmware. After the smart component has been downloaded, there are a few things to note. 1, make sure you have a good backup. 2, even though the controller firmware upgrade can be done online in a dual controller configuration, we recommend you select a time with low I/O array activity to perform the firmware update. 3, launch the downloaded Windows Linux Smart component. In this example, we are launching the Windows Smart component as you can see from the .exe extension. 4, click on the Install button. 5, enter the IP address of either management port on the MSA. And 6, provide the appropriate username and password of a user with the manage role, and then click the Continue button. The Smart component will begin and display a recommended action message. First, you need to click the Install button to proceed. Second, The Smart component will begin the installation and provide progress update messages in the installation log text box. Third, once complete, you will see a green check mark and the device flash successful message for both controller A and B. Fourth, after confirming the successful flash on both controllers, click the close button and both controllers will now be running the new firmware. To verify, you can launch the MSA Storage Management Utility, the SMU, and view the running controller firmware version, or use the CLI command, show versions, like we did earlier. Note, it takes about approximately 30 minutes to complete. The time may vary depending on your configuration, but a maximum duration would be about 90 minutes. Remember, to maximize your MSA uptime and availability, it's important that you keep your MSA running the latest controller firmware version. Make sure to visit hpe.com/storage/MSA firmware to find and locate the latest MSA controller firmware. Back to you, Calvin.
Great info, Kip. Thanks for sharing it with us. You can always find me on Twitter as Calvin Zito. You can find our blog at hpe.com/storage/blog. Until next time, thanks for joining us.